Welcome. I call this Iowa City Community School Board meeting on Tuesday, October 23rd, 2018 to order. My name is Janet Godwin, and I want to thank those in the audience, those watching on YouTube, and those following on Twitter for joining us tonight. I'll start by introducing those at the table with me, starting at my right, Superintendent Steve Murley, Directors Ruthina Malone, Phil Hemingway, Lori Rotland, Sean Easton, JP Clausen, and Kim Colvin, Recording Secretary, and Paul Ressler, who I jumped over. The public is reminded that if they wish to speak, they need to complete a speaker form found at the table in the lobby and turn it in. During community comment, persons may speak to the board about topics relevant to the district. All community comment directed at non-agenda items and agenda items shall take place at the beginning of the meeting during the community comment section of the agenda. And the first topic up is community comment. And Kim, I don't think we've had any speaker forms turned in. So we will move on to approving our agenda for the meeting tonight. I would like to request that we swap items, the attendance area development maps, and go to do the voluntary transfer discussion and action item before that presentation. Any objections to that agenda modification?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So just swapping the voluntary transfer and the attendance area.
Oh,
So voting on voluntary transfer, or having that conversation, and then attendance area, if folks are okay with that.
I move that, oh, sorry, Lori. I move that we approve the agenda with the noted change.
Second.
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open.
I think I need to re-log back in.
How would you like to vote?
Yes.
And Director Rutland, how would you like to vote?
I just got it.
Oh, did you? Okay, thanks. All votes have been cast, and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. Next up, we have the consent agenda. I would like to request pulling Appendix 9.
I move that we approve the consent agenda.
Oh, I would like to pull 14 and 13 and 14.
9, 13, 14.
I move that we approve the consent agenda minus items 13, 14, and 15.
Second.
Before we vote, Phil, would you like to give an update on the bills?
Yes, we spent 2.5 million plus this pay period. Going through the bills, I had 11 questions, and I met with Craig, and we got those taken care of. They were ranging anywhere from unit numbers to greater explanation on where some of the expenses were going. I'll bring to the board's attention that we had 2 Terracon expenditures that it totaled $53,979.27, and to date we have spent $71,285.25 on that contract, and we need to bring that to capacity inside, since we're getting charged to use our own equipment and we have our own expertise in-house.
Any comments or questions for Phil? Thank you, Phil, for doing that. Kim, we're ready to vote on the consent agenda with items 13, 14, 15 removed.
Online voting is open.
I'm having a problem with being logged in, I'm sorry.
How would you like to vote?
Yes.
Yay? Okay, thank you. All votes have been cast, and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. So, item 13.
I just ask about both these together. So just trying to understand, it seems like is there some overlap here? It looks like maybe there's a little I'm just wondering some clarification on the 2 different RFPs.
Sure. When the playground committee started meeting earlier in the year, they did entertain proposals to have a consultant come in and help with some of the work. After reviewing the original proposals, it was determined by the committee to split the work and have one focus on the playground surfaces, and that's the Skolsky contract. and the other to focus on the actual inclusiveness of the playgrounds for use by all students. And so that's the other contract. And so that's how the work was split. And that is why the proposal sheets that came out look the way they do, because we split the work and asked them to resubmit proposals. And so that's how they came back with the committee's recommendation.
Okay.
And will those two work together along with the playground committee? Because I would think inclusiveness and the surfacing all kind of go together. I mean,
Yes. And we've talked to both of them. They understand the parts of the work that we'd like them to help consult on and to work with the playground committee, as the playground committee then works to give Ben and Jeff and Dwayne and their team recommendations about how to move forward on these projects.
Yeah, I'm on the playground committee and sat in on the interviews of these different companies. There was also a third company that came in very high. The Skolsky contract was pushed very highly by staff. It's a nationally recognized expert on ADA, but ADA is not inclusion. And so we were struggling with how do we do the best with our committee and get our goals on making sure that all of our playgrounds are legal and ADA compliant, as well as the board goal of including everyone that way in our play structures. So that's why there's the two contracts, and we pushed as much as we could to bring down the cost and things of that nature when we met, but that's why there's the two.
Well, I would move that we approve both 13 and 14 as presented.
Second.
Okay, I'm ready to vote.
Online voting is open.
there we go.
There it is.
In here, I just closed it to try to open it again. Okay, try it again. Did you vote?
I did the first one, so that I could be recorded.
And you're not getting the thing to vote again. I didn't get you or Phil. How would you like to vote?
Yes.
And Director Hemingway, how would you like to vote?
Yes.
Thank you. All votes have been cast, and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. Appendix 9, I wanted to remove the Tate High addition and renovation item from Appendix 9. I think that we're looking to do some additional work before we bring this to a vote.
I move we approve Appendix 9 minus the Tate addition.
Second.
Kim, ready to vote?
Is it possible to have
Oh,
some
please.
discussion on
Of course. Of course, sure.
Dwayne, could you, and I was looking at this earlier, and I'm glad you pulled that, Janet. So are you going back out for redesign, or you're just still working with this selected firm and you're working the design with them?
The intent is to keep working with the selected firm, and we're just reevaluating the scope.
Okay.
I might add, too, because I think it's worth noting that the item for West High School is a recommendation to reject the bids because the bids came in high. So we're reworking the scope for West High as well. So I don't know if you had time to read the actual item, but that's what it calls for.
Thanks for the clarification, Dwayne.
Can you tell me who made the motion? I'm sorry. Sean? And the second?
All seconded.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? If not, Kim, we're ready to vote.
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast, and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. Next up, we will take our action item on voluntary transfer. I'd entertain a motion to approve the transfer form.
I would move that we approve the transfer form as
Second.
presented.
Second.
Conversation, discussion, comments, questions? I might just note that this is the third meeting we've had this agenda on our board table. We've had two very lengthy discussions at work sessions on this topic. We've had a lot of good input from our community members. We held a community session a week or so ago and tried very hard to take that input into account as we worked our way through it. And so I'd look to board members to offer any comments or questions or further points you'd like to clarify.
I have a couple questions. That's all right. Thank you. Looking at Appendix A, will this be updated with the new boundary numbers once we have the boundary vote?
So what we have on there is as you look down, we have the 2018-19 numbers on there. So those are for this year. You'll notice that Hoover out on American Legion and Grant are in italics. That's based on projected enrollment for those. What we intend to do moving forward is update those after the certified enrollment count every year. And then we will use those numbers for this year as we provide opportunities for transfer for the following year. The enrollment deadline is March 1st for people who apply for voluntary transfers, and we hope that by providing this information as part of the certified enrollment process, that will provide ample time for people to consider what their options are. So we'll do that update every year on October 1st, and it'll be for the current year, and then we'll use that to staff forward for the next year.
Okay, I'm not sure you understood my question. I was meaning, when we change our boundaries in a month?
Oh, yes, okay, so you mean with the new boundaries in there, not today's current boundaries. We won't know who's going to be at those schools until next year. Amy and I have had an extensive conversation about what numbers to use here. We could do projections based on live-in for next year for those boundaries. We were intending to simply use the counts for certified enrollment on each year. We recognize that this year's an anomalous year. We could go either way with that. At this point in time, we've got the current certified enrollment number in there, but if you would like us to base it on projections like we have with Hoover and Grant, we can certainly do that.
My opinion, speaking for myself only, is I would like it to reflect the new boundaries because there are at least two schools that will flip-flop
Yes.
based on where we stand at the moment with our conversations. And some others would move around a little bit, but
Yep, we can definitely do that.
But I'm trying to make sure I understand. What's included in Appendix A right now is certified enrollment for 18-19. We haven't
Correct.
voted on any boundary changes yet, so we're not suggesting changing anything in the form today. It's
Right.
only once we've made any kind of boundary shifts that we would put projections in that would be used for next year. Got it, thank you.
and then going forward, we
Right.
would use certified enrollment.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
And then my second question is, and I don't, I'm just going to preface this with, I don't need to have the policy changed. But I've been thinking about the exception that we have for the Scanlon students and how we have that spelled out. And I've been thinking if we have any other situations that would be like that, the board would have to revisit the policy. And perhaps it would be nice if we had something that was just an explanation of what this is for so that it doesn't have to be revisited by the board every time there's a change. And if that were so, then it would be something like if you are expected to or have had a boundary change in the past year, you would not.
And I think this one was anomalous. We actually presume, as Amy and I are going through the process, if you think about this, when you look at all of these categories for grandfathered students here, we presume that they are all eventually going to go away. And I think we really saw that Scanlon Farms one as an anomalous one when the board went through this last time. We had quite a few parents that came in and were really concerned that their kids could be in as many as 4 schools. I don't think that'll happen very often, and so when we had talked about how to put this in here and how to describe that, we actually are presuming that we won't have a situation like this moving forward, and so we dropped it into the grandfather section as opposed to the exception section, presuming that this is going to go away, and hopefully you're not going to have to revisit language like this after these kids have gone through that process.
Okay. Yeah, and I understand that. If does ever come up that there is a neighborhood that gets switched around within, just a couple of years, I think my personal opinion would be that I would support you making a decision that mirrors the spirit of this information.
That's exactly the conversation we had, and if that happened, then we would bring that back to you, delineate it like this, make sure that the board looked through that, knew what the implications were before we made any changes to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And my thoughts are around this as well, and I guess I'm trying to figure out a way to articulate my thinking on it, is that as we go through this process, and later on we'll look at building blocks and we'll be looking at boundaries and changing things, we have a long-term plan to make significant changes. I see the potential of changes, multiple changes for students being more frequent potentially, depending on, what those next steps are. So I'm not so sure it is just a one-off thing. And I was concerned that it was in there and we didn't discuss it last time because, when it came up when we were doing grants boundaries, we tabled it for a later discussion and then never had the discussion. And it's here. Like Lori said, I'm not, in the mood to change the policy because I think this is an important first step that we have to take to do the rest of our steps. I just think that it's not going to be this one and then done, because I think it will show up in various forms over the next, forever, really. But I don't know. See, I didn't do a good job articulating my thoughts.
No, I think you raise a good point, but I think the one thing that I would say is maybe a little bit different about this is if you think about these four categories, whether they're the permanent elementary transfers from 14-15, our assigned transfers from 15-16, or our ELL, special ed, and 504 transfers, I think this group falls into a group that is similar to those in that they may have made decisions at that point in time predicated on expectations from either the board or the administrative team as they went through that process. I think what might be different about a future one is rather than tabling that conversation, if we have that conversation as we're going through the change, then the parents know about that immediately. And then when they know about that immediately, they can make their plans accordingly at that time. The one thing is we were going through and processing through this, there was a gap between the decision about the new Grant Elementary attendance area boundaries and our conversation about what happens to students who lived in that area. And I think if you tighten up that conversation and that decision-making process, you can have that open discussion with the community at the time that we go through that and better understand where those challenges are. That might help us inform our timeline for those attendance area changes. We might be able to avoid some of those, and if we can't, we can have that pretty open, candid conversation right at the time that's happening. And then, as Lori said, if there's a need to codify that for a specific neighborhood, we can do it right then and there at the time.
Well, perhaps we might have that conversation at our work session later, because I think the argument's going to be if, there was a boundary decision made in 2016 for 2019, that's a lot of time for people to prepare for it, and we're looking at doing stuff, with like a 9-month window, right? And people are going to say, well, we made plans based on expectations that were given to them, and so I think this argument will come sooner than later that, that the same exact argument that's made for Scanlon. So we can talk about it.
If I could just make a note then before you go any further, just a reminder that there are 3 exceptions that are in there that we will be looking at. One, which I've already had a couple of inquiries from parents about, are with 5th grade students. So our capstone process has been fairly consistent with students at the end of a particular pathway, whether that's elementary, 5th going into 6th, junior high, 7th going into 8th. We're following the state rule at the high school going into their junior year as an 11th grader, that we've allowed that capstone transfer to take place, so we have that preserved here. We spent a lot of time, and I appreciate all of your input on the equity balance transfer process so that we could make that hopefully as clear as possible as we look at that. And then the last one, and I know I've had quite a few parents that have asked about good cause exceptions and how they work. Amy's been incredibly beneficial in helping me try to write this so that it is clear as possible. But the intent is to allow those good cause exceptions that exist under the open enrollment laws that the state has authorized to create those avenues for alternate placements for students who follow one of the reasons that are listed therein. And I know we were at the joint municipal meeting and we had a parent who had a question about the foster care process. You can see that on the second line under the good cause exception. And we think that that gives us quite a bit of flexibility to make sure that we're meeting those individual student needs when they have those good cause rationale.
I asked this question of Steve earlier, and he already replied and gave me the answer, but for the sake of it being on the record, could you speak to how you will view these exceptions, capstone, equity balance, not good cause, in cases when there's a new attendance zone built around a new school opening?
Right, and that was, we had some dialogue about the fact that in the past, when we've opened a new school, we have said students that live in that attendance area need to attend that school. And we made that very upfront and forward with the community members because of the voluntary transfer rule and their ability to choose to go elsewhere. And in this case, because we have really limited it to capstone kids, equity balance transfers, and good cause exceptions, there really isn't that ability to just simply select not to attend your home attendance area. So when the board drafts a new attendance zone for a new school, students that live there will be assigned there. They'll be expected to go to school there unless they meet one of the 3 exceptions that we have listed here.
So they would be allowed to stay at their prior school if they're going into 6th grade?
If they're 5th grade, we've done that with the schools that we've opened so far. We've allowed that capstone transfer. So for instance, for Grant, those 5th graders are allowed to stay there. We did that when we opened Borlaug and Garner. We allowed the 5th graders to stay there. We usually get about 75% go and 25% stay.
Thank you.
I'll just add before we vote, I'm going to vote in favor of this with this exception. Two exceptions, actually. I agree with Lori on updating the numbers. And then also, as soon as this vote happens, will you add Shimmick into that list?
Oh my. Yes, I will. I know where they fall. I apologize. We've had a million eyes on this, and that was the first we noted that they're not in there.
I want to follow up, though, on something that Sean was talking about, and so we do have this item on our work session following voluntary transfer. I think one of the things, depending on how the vote goes tonight, we can use that work session to talk about how to maintain and keep the form current, to take into account changes perhaps in boundaries that would cause, additional work to be gone into what other exceptions might need to apply. So for me, it becomes, what are our procedures, processes for maintaining this as a current form that represents the state of our district? And so that could be something that we would cover in a work session, just to get those procedures hammered out. Any other, Phil, please.
Just a couple of comments before we go ahead with this, and I will be voting for it. But everything we do has intended and unintended consequences. And I'm concerned that there will be some families that with this, though, there will be some unintended consequences that will not be beneficial to their individual circumstance. The Hanover report fits well with our board goals and everything that way, but we could find just as many reports that would go against it. We're dealing with, in a lot of these conversations we're having, we're dealing with people's 2 most valuable and prized possessions in their life, where they buy a home and where their kids will go to school. And I think it's important that we give the community some stability in our decisions as well. And some things that we need to address and make sure going forward that we never lose track of the fact how important curriculum is. And we can move kids all around and lock them into schools, but if we don't have a good curriculum, we're still going to be fighting proficiency. Climate, too, is very important, that our school climate is such that it's welcoming of all students and all families. And parent involvement. Parents have to be parents. We have to have them engaged in their students' success and in their students' lives, their academic lives. And as an educational institution, I think we need to make sure that we're focusing on those as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Any other comments, questions? Hearing none, Kim, I think we're ready to vote.
Online voting is open. Phil, I haven't.
I know my screen went here. I didn't move it for a
All
while.
votes have been cast, and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. Moving on to the presentation on attendance area development maps. I think, Steve, you're going to pull up a presentation. I'm just going to make a couple comments. Before we get into that, I want to thank all community members who've engaged with us so far. This is the beginning of the first, presentation at a board meeting of this. We did discuss this at a work session last Tuesday, and we'll be having additional community sessions and work sessions on the topic. I know that I can say that the board is trying to find a balanced approach here. We've had some community members say we're not doing enough and not going fast enough. We've had some community members say we're doing too much and going too fast. And so I think the board, as we said in the statement that we read in our last meeting, we're very, very focused on equitable learning environments. We want to make sure that we make progress towards reaching our equity goals. And that's really the spirit with which this is being presented tonight, knowing that it's incrementally moving us forward towards those goals, but also cognizant of the disruption and the work it will take to implement whatever changes we decide to move forward with, and that we need to give ourselves the time to do that well. And so there's a balance that we're trying to strike as we work our way through this with a sense of urgency, but then also giving ourselves the time to do whatever change comes forward to do it well. So with that context, Steve, do you want to walk us through this?
And I want to thank the board for the dialogue as part of this. So this has really been an evolutionary process as we develop these, and probably most important to recognize is, and I know people don't necessarily see this from the outside looking in, but the board's been very thoughtful and deliberate about identifying building blocks, about talking about the composition of those blocks and where they may fit best, about trying to recognize, on the one hand, the need for stability with the boundaries that were voted on for the 2019-20 school year, but at the same time, looking at where around the edges of those boundaries some changes could be made that would create better balance. And I know that in and of itself is a balancing act. For those that are watching and may not have seen this before, one of the directives from the board was some change, but not too much. With the idea that can we get a little bit better balance without necessarily taking everything apart from that previous decision. So a reminder that we start with those 2019-20 boundaries that were voted on in that 15-16 school year, that formed the foundation of the conversation that we had collectively around the work session table. And again, appreciation for the identification of some of those building blocks, the opportunity to take a look at those and figure out how they fit best together. Appreciate the reminder at the last work session to go back through all of the blocks that you'd identified over time. There are really only two blocks that you're not going to see in this process. So those who've been looking back over all the work session agendas, when we were trying to look at how to right size Grant Wood and Alexander Elementary, we looked at some areas along the north side of those two attendance areas. So those are the only two building blocks going back all the way to August that you don't see reflected in the maps today. So again, appreciate the time and the energy that you spent helping us identify those, and that is not big enough to see. Let's try this. So one of the things that we did was we took a look at the enrollment as it stands again for 2018-19 for this school year. For those who have been following along, this transitioned as we got through October, because prior to that we didn't have certified enrollment for the 18-19 school year. We do now. Probably the most important thing to note in that first column that has the shading in green from most to least when you look at the percentage of students who are of low socioeconomic statuses. For the first time, we have a school in Kirkwood Elementary that is over the 80% threshold. And I know that that was a big focus of the conversation that we had at the board table, was to look at some of our outlier schools and really look at how can we make some changes in those areas to make sure that those schools better meet the needs of their students. That first column that has the red shading in it, that is our capacity numbers for this year. You'll note that in the darkest red there, you have a school like Garner that's at 131%. You know, if you're up at Garner and you look out on the west side of that campus, there are quite a few modulars parked out there. So we've got a couple schools that are in that area right now. Lucas Elementary would be another one. And one of the reasons you see that in schools like Lucas and Gardner is because the foresight of the board to build some schools in those neighborhoods to try to alleviate some of that overcrowding. And so we're going to see some benefits as new Hoover and Grant Elementary School come online and make room for those students so that those schools aren't quite as crowded. If you look over onto the right-hand side, you see projected 2019-20 numbers. And there are a couple major differences between those two columns. In that second column, we looked at the students that live in those neighborhoods. So we have assigned in that column all the students that live in that particular elementary attendance area to that school. So you can see there's some pretty notable changes in the numbers. I might draw your attention to Kirkwood Elementary School. You can see that there are 352 students listed there for this current school year, and you show only 327 for the next year. One of the things you're going to see as we walk through here is that in order to make that happen, 92 students were reassigned as part of that process. So if you were to add those back in, you'd recognize that there are almost 425 kids that live in the Kirkwood attendance area, and yet today only 352 of those students attend the Kirkwood attendance area. And so that's one of the reasons why we just had the conversation that we did about voluntary transfers. So these are all the live-in students. We went out to the end of the facility master plan, so that's 2021-22. You can see the capacity numbers when we finally completed it. One of the reasons we wanted to do that goes back to what Phil just said a moment ago about providing some level of stability for people in the community. We want to look out to the end of the FMP, look at how many seats we'll have available, and then consider how we want to fill our buildings as we grow into those spaces. You can see that at least at this point in time, all the schools are under 100%. That's a wonderful thing. Got a couple schools that are closer than we'd like to see them. We really like to see those schools in the 90 to 95% range at the max, because that gives us room for growth and also provides some program flexibility. You can also see some of the schools look pretty low. And I want to make sure that people understand why you see some of those schools looking particularly low. When we look at classrooms in schools, we don't look at the school as having a particular demographic profile. We look at it as a building, and we say, in that building, how many students can we place in a classroom? And whether we're east, west, north, south, we will use that same standard to fill that particular classroom, which then fills that school. That creates a problem for us. Alexander would be a great example of that. People in the community have said, wait a minute, you built Alexander, it's a brand new school. I drive by, I see there's a couple of modulars parked out there. How did that happen? Well, as the board went through the process of looking at how best to meet our students' needs and put the RAM model in place, that necessitated significantly smaller classes in our high-need schools. That means that those classrooms hold fewer students, and therefore the same number of students requires more space in that building. So we were very deliberate when we went through this time and tried to look at the carrying capacity in our buildings that have high needs and require smaller class sizes. And we were pretty deliberate in trying to make sure that our capacity utilization in those buildings was significantly smaller. So as you go down the list and you look at a school like Hills at 67%, you go across and look at a school like Twain at 63%. Keep in mind, we're recognizing the need to have smaller class sizes in those buildings, and therefore the need to make sure that we populate it with a smaller number of students. So although it appears that the capacity level is perhaps unutilized there, please remember that that is actually occupied by the same number of students in more classrooms. When you look at the next chart here, we thought it was important to be able to look perhaps graphically at where we're seeing changes in our population of students that are considered to be low socioeconomic. And you can see from all the way over on the right with Penn Elementary School, you travel to the left with Hills Elementary School. You can see them rank ordered from high to low. The rank order is based on the orange bar, which is the 2019-20 new attendance area number. One thing that I will point out as we go through here is that we now only have 3 schools above 70%. And remember, I told you this year we actually have one over 80%. So we're pleased to see some reduction there. We've been looking at that district average number. You saw that on the voluntary transfer sheet. And obviously our goal would be to have as many schools at the district average as possible. You can see that Hoover, as it opens up, is very close to that district average, which is where we would prefer to be. Maybe another way to look at it is those schools that are losing or gaining the most students in that low socioeconomic status category. Based on some feedback from the board at previous work sessions, you'll see that the gap between Hills and Man, which are the 2 schools on the end, is significantly smaller than it was before. Through some conversation at the board table, there was a discussion to retain the Forest View neighborhood in the Man Elementary School. We know that that particular part of town is going through some transformation, and we thought that would provide some additional stability for those students. What that does is that helps reduce the impact on Lincoln and reduce the impact on Man. So you see the numbers there being slightly smaller than they were the last time around when we looked at these numbers. And by the way, I know you've all seen this before, but please stop me if you have questions or things that we think we may need to make sure that the general public is aware of. The next set of maps are all going to be very similar as you go through the template here. Draw attention to some color coding on the right-hand side. You'll see, in this case, Alexander is this pink color. That's today's attendance area. The red are proposed attendance boundaries for the 1920 school year as approved by the board. In this orange, yellowish highlighted one, that's the proposal for the attendance area given the changes that are on the table. So in this case, you see that there's a large portion of the Alexander attendance area that's moved. As you look at this, you see that these students are not going to Longfellow, they're going to Hoover.
No, it's Longfellow.
Is it Longfellow? Wait a minute, why am I?
You're taking out the ones that were supposed to go there from Twain.
Sure, thanks, sorry about that. I'm looking at the Wood kids that are going to Hoover. So in this case, sorry, we've got the Lake Ridge kids that are over here that were assigned to Longfellow in the new attendance areas approved for 1920, and those students are moving up to Longfellow. Thanks, Paul. I've also shown the numbers there for the low socioeconomic status students so you can see that transition. Again, I'm going to go through these now. I know you've seen all these relatively quickly, but just make some notes there about who's moving where. At Borlaug, the Boston Way neighborhood is moving down to Borlaug in order to make room for them. You can see that's 92 students coming in. We've got 93 students going out, and that's some students that live down here on the south of the Borlaug attendance area. Some of those students will wind up going to Horn, some to Weber. Coralville Central, again, trying to right-size the building and make sure we've got room for the appropriate class sizes here. We've got a population of students that live south of Oakdale that will go to Wickham and help us utilize some of the space that's available at Wickham. At Hills, this is a kind of a difficult discussion. I had a long conversation with the staff down there. We did talk extensively about right-sizing the building. They're pretty concerned about economies of scale and making sure that they have enough kids in there to have the right number of special sections and to have the right class sizes at each cohort level. So even though the building is a little more crowded than we would like to see it under this model, they were pretty insistent that they retain the student base that they have right now, with the exception of the small area up here that goes to Longfellow. I know that we're working now to try to set up a meeting with the Hills City Council to talk about how remodeling Hills and revisioning the way that school looks could better meet the community's needs and the school's needs. And the one thing that this would do is give us that opportunity then to figure out how to accommodate the students that we have in that attendance area right now. Hoover out on American Legion, where I was busy getting confused with all our colors before. So as this school opens up, one of the things that we talked about at length at the board meeting was making sure that we use more of the space available there. Lori, I think you were asking about space available seats at New Hoover and how we might take better advantage of that. So one of the things that we did from the last meeting to this meeting is we added some additional students from this area of Wood right here. You'll see that when we get to the map. We talked about the Bon Air neighborhood before, and we went to the east of that and included this neighborhood also. So that moves a total of 54 students to Wood. If you look back to last week, we were looking at about 37 students to Wood, so a few more students there. We've also got a group of students coming down here from Lemmy. You can see that there's a large area of Lemmy that was already going to be assigned to New Hoover, and this simply expands that to the west. We also, and I know this is really hard to see on here, but down here, this is the Breckenridge neighborhood. Those students were originally, they assigned to New Hoover. They are currently Lemmy students. A lot of conversation with the folks at Lemmy about the need to make sure that they maintained their diverse student population, and there was a request for us to consider retaining them at Lemmy as opposed to transferring them to New Hoover. So again, hard to see because it's a small geographic area, but this was part of New Hoover and now winds up going to Lemmy. At Horn, your landmark here, this is Mormon Trek, and so we're looking at adding this area here into Horn. This is Benton Street, so if you do your geographic markers, there's a stoplight right here. There's a shopping mall here where you see No Children, Fairway, UI Credit Union. So those students would be assigned there. Again, that makes room at Borlaug for us to move the Boston Way neighborhood in. At Kirkwood, and this is, again, a great example of how we're trying to right-size a building. One of the things that we know is that even given the remodeling and the expansion that's going on at Kirkwood, we're still awfully full right now. On the east side of the campus, we have modulars out there. This allows us to move all the students inside and accommodate the smaller class sizes. And so we're looking at moving Boston Way out. I think, I apologize, I don't remember who pointed it out, but at one of the previous board meetings, we talked about the attendance support busing that's currently provided for Boston Way, and this allows us to simply redirect that busing down to Borlaug. Lemmy, again, this map looks awfully small only because now we've got the Breckenridge neighborhood here reassigned to Lemmy. Maybe one of the things to point out, this is a good map to show this. So we've got a significant change in the Lemmy attendance area as Hoover on Court Street closes and those students are reassigned. So you see a large number of former Hoover students assigned to Lemmy in this model. Lincoln Elementary School, and again, this was the change that we discussed at the board work session last time. This is your Forest View neighborhood right here, and so those students have been reassigned to Man, and there's 44 kids that live in this neighborhood right here. So the Man attendance area stays as drafted by the board and passed for 1920, with the exception now of the movement of those students to Man Elementary School. Here's your Longfellow map, and again, extensive discussions at the board work session about our Lake Ridge neighborhood here, and maybe just set the stage for that. We looked at Alexander earlier. I talked to you about the fact that here's a school that's brand new, and yet we've got modulars outside. Now we've got a large number of students, from 114 of them from that Lake Ridge neighborhood that had originally been planned to attend Alexander. We took a look at that collectively at former work sessions and realized that it was simply too large a burden for that building to contain all those students. And the question was about reassignment. One of the things that we've been fortunate as we've gone through and done our remodeling at Longfellow is we've been able to more efficiently use the space inside that building. So we've captured a couple of additional classrooms, and that allowed us to increase the capacity there. So there's ability to move our students from Lake Ridge up to Longfellow. At Man, again, we've got the Forest View neighborhood here. So you see the neighborhood as drafted by the board. A really small area that you're going to see down here, which we talked about at one of our August meetings, was the Washington Place neighborhood. So we've reassigned that to Longfellow based on the commute patterns that were presented by parents. And then again, we added those students from Forest View into Man. At Twain, the attendance area remains the same with the exception of the reduction of the area here to the west, and that allows us to build that bridge from Lake Ridge up to Longfellow. So a very small number of students moved out of there. Maybe important to note, though, that the Lake Ridge kids were in Twain this year, and so that's going to be a significant change to the population for Twain for next year. If you've been in Twain, you know that their library, unfortunately, has had a classroom built in it and now serves Title I, Reading Recovery, and other programs in there, and it really is no longer a library. Unfortunately, art is in the proverbial art on a cart right now, which we also know is not ideal, so this is going to allow us to right-size Twain, get all the teachers back into regular classrooms, ensure that our specials all have their dedicated spaces. Weber Elementary School, and this is a large geographic area. If you know this, we're coming out Raritt Road here, coming on Highway 1 here. So the area that, if you think about this from a landmark standpoint, you've got Menards, McDonald's out here. So you've got a group of students that right now, it's this area right here, if you can follow the cursor. And that's bounded by Raritt, by Mormon Trek, and by the highway. And so there's a series of apartment complexes out there, and those will be reassigned to Weber Elementary School. Wickham, part of the decision by the board for the 1920 boundaries was to take this segment of Van Allen and move it over to Wickham. Remember, this was an area that you looked at for grandfathering, and so small number of students over here on that east side of that attendance area. And then again, we added this area that is south of Oakdale and north of the highway to Wickham, so that we can take advantage of the space available to us at Wickham. And then Wood Elementary School, right back by Alexander, where I was busy confusing myself at the beginning here. So here's your Wood Elementary School boundary. When we tried to right-size Alexander to make room for the Lake Ridge kids back in 15-16, one of the things that we did was we added these portions of Alexander into Wood. In order to make sure that we got enough classroom space available at Wood, we continued to have these students assigned to Wood Elementary, but we took the students here that are off Highway 6, and again, those students are moving to Hoover. All right. I know I went really quick. Yeah, I know you folks have seen this several times, but I would ask if there are things that I've missed or questions that you have, either now or as we prepare to set into the work session after this.
Things folks would like to say. I know that folks have got questions and comments prepared.
I know at the last work session, you discussed that our building principals had saw that this plan,
Yes.
I believe earlier that day or sometime really recent. So given that it's been a week, have you received more feedback from them regarding these changes? And if so, is there any that you could share?
Yeah, I'd certainly ask Amy to join in. I think probably the common refrain has been, how soon can we have a final decision so we can start communicating with parents? That's really been the big question. I know a couple of our buildings that are already slated to see some change want to make sure that they get the numbers so that they know if I had X number of kids that were moving before, and now I've got X plus. I've already done some things to help that group of students that's moving be prepared for doing that. How can I then bring the rest of those families up to speed so that they're moving at the same path as those that I already knew were going to move? For instance, the Hoover parents are probably our most active group, so they've known they're going to move. They've known since that decision where they're going to move to. So the principals in those buildings that are receiving, and Dennis as a sender, they've been meeting regularly to talk about that transition process. And so they've looked at it and said, if I'm getting more kids than just those students from Hoover, how soon will I know who those are so that I can work to bring them up to speed at the same point we have with these other very systemic meetings that we've had going on. Amy? Yeah, that's a common refrain, that regardless of who's gaining, they're excited about meeting new families and kids, but they're all very sad about the students that they're losing.
And you spoke about Twain not having enough space and using the library and special space for general classrooms. So with this move, with other schools, does that mean that they will no longer have a need for portables with this move? Or are we adding more students to be placed in portables at some of the schools like that's already have portables? Like,
So one of the things
Wood, I
that,
think they have some.
one of the things that Dwayne has been asking me about repeatedly, so not a building principal, but coming from one of our central office folks, is remember that these numbers here, as we look at our percent of capacity, are built on completing the facility master plan. So some of that work still needs to be done. So one of the questions that Dwayne has asked repeatedly is, when this goes through, we need to look at where we are today, where we're going to be tomorrow, and recognizing that that may not be, this may be, you know, beyond that. So how do we make sure that if there's any need for portable movement, modular movement between now and next fall, we've got the time to get that done, and we've got a plan in place to do that. So we've got a few projects, obviously, that we still have in the facility master plan that are underway. We tried to take that into consideration where we could, because we prefer to move as few modulars as possible. We'd like to get rid of as many as possible and then move as few as possible when we're done with that. So that's been part of our conversation about how many students wind up moving in, and where is our capacity for 21, 22, and what do we look like in between there. One of the things we don't know, and Amy and I are a little stressed about this because it makes it hard to answer Dwayne's question, is we don't know how many of those folks that have that grandfather opportunity will exercise it. We also don't know how many equity transfer requests we're going to get. And so obviously that could significantly put some significant challenges in the way for us. Our equity transfers are on a space available. Our grandfather requests are part of that permanent process where we'd allow them to stay. We need to know those first. That'll give us an idea what kind of space we need, and then we'll know what kind of seats are available. Then we can work with Dwayne to make sure we have the right buildings in the right places. Thank you. That's a great question.
Can I follow up on that a little bit? I was wondering, can somebody refresh my memory of what is in the plan for Borlaug, that they're not gaining capacity? They're doing something, I know, but.
Well, two things there. We are adding the music and art room, which will free up 2 rooms that it will increase capacity, but we went back and reevaluated the building and right-sized it. So we are adding space, but the numbers, as I recall, didn't change a lot because
Didn't change at all on the sheet that I have here.
I think that's how we counted our regular classrooms and the capacity in those.
You're adding,
Actually, we reduced it. Back when we did the original evaluation of Borlaug, we were at 551, and with the proper resizing and adding those 2 rooms, we're at 468.
okay. And then, I think I asked this at the work session, is 240 the number after Lincoln gets their remodel done? I seem to remember that the number was bigger than that, but.
240 is the right number.
Okay. I have a lot of specific questions that I will save until our work session, but one thing I want to just kind of have on the record, I did send a couple thoughts to Steve earlier, and I bring it up here just to get it in people's head, because one thing as we talk about moving, in some cases 100 kids from this place to another place, that affects staffing levels. So I wanted to make sure that, they were thinking of it and admin is thinking of it, but that's something we should also be cognizant of making large changes, that it will affect staffing too. And the other thing that I brought up is, as we changed, for instance, I think I used Boston Way as the example, right? If they're moving from Kirkwood to Borlaug, that's a change in a secondary feeder pattern as well. So I don't know, I'd like to at least try and look at some of those numbers of the various places where we would change secondary attendance zones for kids as well, because I don't think we've got a good handle on that, but I wanted to at least be part of the conversation.
I have some questions that I will ask later in our work session, but for Dwayne, since you won't be here later, I am going to ask about the capacity of a couple situations here. So Kirkwood says it's going to have a capacity of 141 students They are getting 2 classrooms plus
Right.
music and art. In their temporaries right now, they have ELP and music.
Well, this template or capacity hasn't been updated with the accelerated plan. When we approved that, we reduced the number of classrooms that we were adding at Kirkwood. So I probably need to go back and reevaluate that number.
Okay, so their capacity is not expected to be 468.
I don't believe so, but we were going to originally add 4 classrooms, I believe, and now we're adding 2, and so it has changed. So I will go back and reevaluate that, get that for you.
Okay. And then, as the board knows, we received an email from a constituent asking about Wickham having an increase in 131 students, yet today they have 2 portables and 481 students, and they're getting, I think, a music and art room.
Well, there's quite a long email chain associated with that and discussions that I've had with that community person about that building. And first thing I would say is that enrollment is not capacity, and capacity is based on the number of rooms and how rooms can be used, not necessarily how they're being used. So I feel that that capacity number of Wickham of was 575 is correct, based on what we're going to do, and that's add a music and art room, which will add 2 more classrooms there.
And maybe one of the things that's a great opportunity to just remind folks that we have our regular ed programming in there. You talked about ELP programming, so we've got programming like that that's consistent in every building. But then we have some programs that might be high incidence, low numbers in special education in particular. And there are some programs like that that are at Wickham. And so they take up entire classrooms. Wouldn't necessarily have a full classroom of students as we measure that under the capacity model. And so that's one of the things that Amy and Lisa Glenn and I have talked about, is where those programs are, where they might be optimally located so that there may be more space available to them in various buildings. Also recognizing the implication that that might have for parents and staff. So we certainly haven't made any decisions on that, but something that's definitely on Lisa's radar as she looks at those.
In my humble opinion, it would be okay to, if you have special programming in a room and a room is not being used for general education, to reduce the capacity accordingly, because it's very misleading when you look at this and it says that they're adding 131 seats and they're only getting music and art, and they're losing 2 portables. So I understand what you're saying, but it's very misleading to the community. So, and likewise, if we move those programs somewhere else, it'll be hard there to understand.
Yeah, we've struggled with that because it's a RAM issue too, and so, you know, should we be going into schools that have smaller class sizes and then looking at the K2 and the 3-6 numbers and counting how many rooms there are that are occupied by kindergarten, first, second grade, and then consequently lowering the capacity there so that it's in line with the RAM. So we've really struggled with the idea of how many people can you put in this room regardless of who they are, or how many people could you put in this room if they were a RAM 2 class of kids or a RAM 3 class of kids? How many can you put in there? And then should you measure the capacity on how many people could stand in the room or how many people you would choose to educate in the room? And we might have to put 2 numbers out there.
And that would be fine.
Capacity in a standardized format and capacity as used.
Yeah, I think that would actually be very helpful to do it that way. And then I'll just for the record, for those that are watching, I'm just going to say that one of the things I'm going to ask in the work session is in regards to our smallest schools that are under our district average for FRL, that are, we've got Shimmick and Lincoln, both under 200 students. So that's something that I want to talk about as a board. So just for the record, I'll be bringing that up.
I'll just make a comment, kind of going on what Sean said, if it's going to change staffing, because I met with ICEA last week and gave them the AAD presentation. And, you know, one of their concerns is just for those teachers who've been in one type of building, a low FRL building, and then moving into significant higher numbers, just some they just want to be ready. They want to be prepared to teach those kids. And I think we don't know what we don't know. And so whatever we can do to help support them. I know some of this is you're going to learn from experience, but then I'm hopeful that we can get, one of the reps brought up like something like ACEs training is probably super valuable for folks to understand adverse childhood experiences if you're going to be seeing more of those. So I think, between, and then, they realize, well, the PD schedule is set. So adding more trainings is pretty complicated. But whatever we can do to kind of help support them and sort of ease their mind so they can go into this new assignment with, really looking forward to it. And it's not that they're not. I think they just don't feel prepared. So I'll just.
And we followed up, we had our ICEA leadership meeting on Friday after you worked with them, and so we had the opportunity to follow up with them literally the next day. We know we've got 4 schools that are probably most heavily impacted by this. Every school will have some change to it, but we have 4 schools in particular, and probably 2 of those 4 that have the most marked need. And so we had talked at length with the ICEA leadership about what those opportunities might look like.
Just point out, this is another great result of having a really good relationship with our group, that we can do this stuff ahead of time, and we're not doing this next year when people are complaining and we're having all kinds of issues, that we can get out in front of it. So.
Other comments that folks would like to make before we take this topic into work session?
Brief comment, and you kind of touched on it, but I think we've all kind of looked at this as a puzzle or like a Lego structure or something, where voluntary transfers was one part of it. This boundary change, which is a small change for next year, is another part. We're building to get where we want to go. It doesn't move some numbers a great deal one way or another, but it does make movement, and that's what we're trying to get towards. Unfortunately, there's nothing that we're doing is the magic answer to get us where we want to go. So it's a lot of multiple steps, and I think we're doing a pretty good job of being pretty thorough and going through this block by block and piece by piece, and seeing which ones fit to make that end game. So.
Yeah, incremental progress towards our equity goals, and I just want to highlight something Phil said earlier, and it kind of gets at JP's comments too around culture, making sure that we're focusing on climate, and whether it's training, whether it's implicit bias, programming, additional, you mentioned a different training course that might be helpful, JP, but we've got to be not just moving students, we have to be making sure our climate is accepting and ready for those students to be successful, and I think those are additional conversations we need to have our eyes on as we move through this. This takes years to hit the kind of equity goal that we have in front of us. It's going to take years of focus and hard work and commitment and engagement and people rowing in the same direction, so. Anything else from directors on this? Thanks, Steve, for walking through that, and admin team for helping to put that together. Amy, I know you spent a ton of time on this, and many others, so thank you for your hard work on this and getting us to this point. So let me get back to our agenda. We are on agenda setting. Yeah, sure.
I apologize. One of the things that I wanted to draw attention to, because I think, that people may not be as aware of, and just so that they think about it moving forward, is that there are additional opportunities, and I know we're going to talk about agenda setting here, but maybe it helps for people to see those. There are additional opportunities in front of us. Obviously, we're at a regular work meeting right now. We've got a work session tonight. There are 2 community meetings next week on the 30th, one at Northwest Junior High, one at Southeast Junior High. It's a board work session on the 6th. There's another community meeting on the 8th. Then we have the 13th, where we have both a regular meeting and a work session scheduled. And then the 27th, where we have a regular meeting and a work session that are available to us. And then we have the 11th. So just to give everybody an idea of where we are between now and the end of the calendar year.
Good, that's a nice segue into agenda setting. But I also want to shout out to Adam as well. I know he's done an awful lot of work supporting the maps and presenting the material tonight. So with that, moving into the agendas in front of us, Steve has already mentioned on October 30th, we have 2 community listening post sessions, one at Northwest Junior High, one at Southeast Junior High. The time is from 6 to 7:30. And board members will divvy up and spend time with community members, hearing their input and ideas and thoughts about the work that we're doing. On the 6th, we have a work session to continue the conversation, share what we learned at the community listening post and bring that into the discussion around our boundaries. We also have at that session an update from our equity committee on family and community engagement.
Take the voluntary transfer off of that then, since we had our vote?
You know, I'm
talk
still
about it.
resonating on, we may, if there's process, procedures, things that we need to talk about from an implementation standpoint, that's an opportunity for us to perhaps get some input or ask some questions about status of that. I'd maybe just
That's
leave it on. Good question, though. I mentioned the work session on the 6th. Then we, as Steve mentioned, have another community meeting on the 8th of November. This one's at Southeast Junior High, again, 6 to 7:30. Any changes or refinements or adjustments that we will have put into place from the previous listening posts and work sessions would be presented in the session on November 8th.
Sorry. Can we back up just one, the 6th, the meeting on the 6th? Will that need to be elsewhere for voting?
Oh, because of the, it's yeah, election. Good catch.
Do you have a preference? I know we use Southeast for consistency, but we can certainly move somewhere else. If we like Southeast, we can definitely take a look at it and see if we've got space available there.
Yeah, consistency is probably good. I mean, I absolutely prefer Northwest, but
I actually was thinking Northwest might be better because the meeting on the 8th is at Southeast Junior High. So we have one meeting that week at Northwest, one meeting that week at Southeast.
I'll take it. Sure.
I'll work on it.
I'll
Okay.
stand firm on my preference for Northwest.
Does Northwest have voting? No, because it's at the library?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. I think we can be at Northwest.
Okay. JP, you win, yay.
We drive to Southeast.
Okay, so that gets us up to November 13th, which is a board meeting. And we've got our standard items, student representatives, ICEA update, community comment, consent agenda. We'll discuss at the 13th meeting what we've, the next version, if there is one, of the attendance area, taking the input from community listening posts and work sessions. And then we have an action item around approval of GeoBond preliminary official statement and electronic bidding. And so that's the proposed agenda for November 13th. And then the work session that evening, as you can imagine, is going to continue to focus on the attendance area work and the community and school outreach agenda. Steve, remind me what that is?
It's where you've got to
That's
talk
just
to
the
the
community
community
meetings.
about.
Sorry?
Just to talk about the
Oh,
last meeting.
okay.
from
All right.
Just our
Same, continuing the conversation.
the-
Got it.
From the 8th.
So that's what we have in front of us for agendas. We've got a busy schedule, and I appreciate everyone's time and energy, and Steve, to your team for supporting us through this process. With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Could I ask a question before we
Please.
adjourn, please? The enrollment report, I know that sometimes we've received it in December. I want to say sometimes we received it in October. What's that?
The class sizes where we're at after the beginning of the year in October. But that report is going to be also embedded in the enrollment report in January, where we
Okay.
show class sizes.
Okay, I just didn't know if there were any pieces of that that we should be taking into account as we look at this information. And if not, that's fine. But just as you prepare the report, if there's something that we need to know, please let us know. I move that we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.